Dear guests, welcome to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My name is Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. I'm the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, located on the Treaty 6 territory. It also means that I would like to welcome you to the land of many indigenous peoples and Métis peoples, the land who we have been living on, working on, enjoying ourselves when time is off. And for us to mention this particular relationship is important because it means we recognize the primacy and the caregivers of this land being indigenous peoples first. I'm very pleased to welcome all to the ongoing seminar series titled Rethinking Ukraine's Environment, War, Ecocide, and Beyond. This international series aims to foster a deeper understanding of historical human-environment relationships, connections as a vital factor in addressing Ukraine's current environmental challenges and envisioning secure and sustainable futures. We have started the seminar series this particular fall, and I'm extremely pleased to be welcoming all of our speakers today. At the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, we have historically been focusing on what we could call traditional areas of research: history, language, culture, Ukrainian Canadian culture in particular. But recently, with the gift we have received from the Roy Bukovsky's family, we were able to offer a Bukovsky Research Grant for the study of sustainable development. And I wanted to bring everyone's attention to the fact that we have an open competition, in particular for this funding opportunity as well. And several years ago, with the beginning of the full-scale phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war, we in particular started supporting research activities focused on the environment. Without much further to say, I would like to pass on the torch of hosting this seminar to my dear colleague, Anna Olenenko, and please welcome.
Thank you, Natalia, for your welcoming words. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our seminar series, Rethinking Ukrainian Environment, War, Ecocide, and Beyond. I was very happy to organize this seminar series together with Environmental History of Ukraine Research Group, together with Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and our partners. Our last seminar was dedicated to the concept of ecocide and war, environmental destruction in Ukraine. And today we are going to talk about waste, epidemics, and human health in environmental studies. First of all, let me introduce our today's speakers, who will present the topic from different perspectives and different times. The first will be Tetiana Perga, who received her PhD from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv in Ukraine. She worked at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine for over 30 years and has participated in numerous international conferences and programs funded by various foundations. Currently, Tetiana is affiliated with the Technical University of Berlin. And her current project, Waste in Totalitarian Regimes, Recycling in the Early Soviet Union, Ukrainian Contexts, deals with the social, economic, and ideological dimensions of waste collections and recyclings in 1920s, 1930s in Ukraine. Tetiana is a member of European Society of Environmental History and the Leo Baeck Institute Research Group in Jewish Environmental History. She serves as an expert for the Ministry of Education and Sciences of Ukraine and is a member of the editorial boards of two Ukrainian academic journals. I would also add that Tetiana was one of the first who became the member of European Society of Environmental History, and she was the first original representative of Ukraine at this organization. Our next presenter is Natalia Laas. She is assistant professor of environmental history at Washington University in St. Louis. She is currently working on a book project on the waste and socialist environmental thinking titled A Soviet Consumer Republic, Environmental Citizenship and the Economy of Waste and Post-Second World War Soviet Union. Her articles appeared in Slavic Review and Critica, explorations in Russian and Eurasian history, and Natalia's research has been supported by multiple grants, among which the most recent one is a CLS fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. Natalia received her PhD in the history from Brandeis University and worked as a postdoctoral fellow at New York University and Yale University. And our third presenter is Dmytro Yesypenko. He's affiliated with the Fulcrum Center and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, where he contributes to projects of Ukrainian Canadian heritage and cultural history. She holds a Candidate of Sciences degree in philology from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and is completing a PhD in transnational and comparative literature at the University of Alberta. His research bridges literary studies and cultural history, encompassing medical humanities, scholarly editing, Central and Eastern European history, and diaspora cultures. So welcome to this seminar, and thank you for agreeing to take part in this important conversation. So dear speakers, you will have up to 20 minutes for your talk, and after that we will have a Q&A session. Thank you, and Tetiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to give my presentation, and once more thank the organizers for the invitation. Waste recycling is often associated with the environmental aspects. Environmental movements, environmental policy, and the environmental awareness phenomena emerged during the Cold War era. And my presentation is about the origins and development of the state policy and practice of waste recycling in Ukraine, which has existed for more than 100 years. The war, which lasted 7 years, left traces of destruction, a multitude of diverse debris, scraps, and shreds. They are the only valuable resources we still possess, and on these debris and shreds, we must and can begin to build a new industry. And noted one report of 1922. And under this slogan, Waste as Resources, stated waste collection and recycling activities in Ukraine in the early 1920s. During the period of industrialization, this motto was supplemented with new ideological emphasis: liberation from foreign dependence and strengthening the country's defense capability. And from the very beginning, waste recycling activity was highly ideologized, as waste had a strategic importance for industrial enterprises. The recognition of its potential as important secondary resource led to a reassessment of the very concept of waste and transforming it to the valuable raw material. And official rhetoric began calling it gold on the dump and unused treasuries and many others. Archival documents give the impression of a waste fever that happened in Ukraine in 1920s. Due to high demand and profit of purchase sale transactions, many individuals, consumer cooperative, charities, employers, various institutions, and even banks were involved in waste collection. And one of the peculiarities of the Ukrainian context is the connection of waste with the charity. In the early 1920s, the idea of waste collection was colored by a distinct sense of revolutionary utopianism. The Bolshevik government in Ukraine and the representative of Red Cross considered that businesses and the population would demonstrate revolutionary conscientiousness and donate their waste free of charge to the waste collecting organizations. However, this idea failed. In contrast, the idea of earning money from operation with waste for charitable activities and solving the social problems appeared. It was institutionalized in the creating one of the largest waste collecting company, non-governmental company, Ukr-Utilsbir, by 3 charitable organizations: the Office of the Authorized Representative of the Central Committee for Child Aid, the Ukrainian Red Cross, and the All-Ukrainian Central Committee for Aid to Sick and Wounded Red Army Soldiers. It was envisaged that approximately 40% of Ukr-Utilsbir income would be invested in activities of these co-funders and for the fulfillment of their humanitarian programs. And one can see on this slide that only during 1 year, about 300,000 rubles of dividends received these companies. The Soviet government was obsessed with the idea of waste recycling. However, despite numerous experiments, initiatives, and ideological support, it was never able to create a truly effective and stable management mechanisms. In the 1920s, waste market emerged in Ukraine. And on the one hand, it was demand for the waste from the state industrial enterprises. And on the other side, it was a huge proposition of waste left after the First World War, Russian Revolution, and Ukrainian Revolution. The main consumers or buyers of waste were Soviet industrial enterprises that were a part of the largest state trusts, sugar trust, paper trust, and so on. The group of suppliers or waste collectors consisted of many different actors. All state trusts had their own collection apparatus, so they were simultaneously buyers and suppliers. And in addition, there were 2 big companies, Ukr-Utilsbir and Rusavtox. They were private companies. And the waste collection also involved the rural consumer communities, Vukhovspilka, as well as various artels, brigades, private entrepreneurs, and individuals working as subcontractors. A distinctive feature of the Ukrainian context was that despite of the new economic policy, People's Commissariat of Trade of Ukraine, or Narkomtorg, responsible for waste collection, tried to control and manage waste market. So all actors, including non-governmental organizations and many private individuals, had to fulfill targets set for the Republic from Moscow. Necessity to fulfill plans caused a very complicated relation between all actors. They entered into contracts not only with subcontractors, but also with each other, buying and reselling waste missing to meet their plans. And very often, the chains of waste delivery could include 3-4 intermediators, with each participant profiting from these transactions. However, this was not the expression of corruptions, but it was only the consequence of strict plan deficit. So it's about human capital. The main challenge of waste collecting system in 1920s was the absence of experienced staff. And there were 2 groups of workers. One I called the white-collar workers. They were accountants, secretaries, economists, and managers. And the main principle for their hiring was at least some education, secondary, uncompleted secondary, or higher education. So the possibility to read, write, and calculate. And the second criteria was the experience of work in interconnected fields, such as trade, retail, and so on. And the second group of workers, I called it blue-collar workers. They were agents, collectors, and the sorters, people who directly participated in waste collecting. And often these people had not education at all. They could not read, write, and calculate. Waste collection activities was low-paid, low prestige, dirty and manual job, and its workers were often stigmatized. and they had to fulfill very high plans. And for example, a sorter had to sort from 300 to 500 kilograms per day, and the norm for packing was more than 1,200 kilograms. And the work was low paid, low prestige, dirty, manual work, and their work was very often stigmatized. And these people had very high plans for collecting, for sorting, and that's why it's clear that there were few people willing to work in this system. And that's why companies tried to find stuff in different ways, and particularly in Mykolaiv in 1932, the city council established recycling kiosks and engaged prostitutes here. And in documents, archival documents, I read that all prostitutes were very pleased for this work. They received 300 rubles per month, and during the meeting they were awarded by certificates of the shop workers. And the main waste collected in Ukraine included different groups, but the main 6 were metals, rugs, paper, bones, broken glass, and old rubber. Of course, it was a group of the agricultural waste, and from the late 1920s appeared a new group of so-called industrial waste, and this happened when the Soviet enterprises were rebuilt and began to develop. The interesting fact that waste, particularly rugs and bones, were used not only by the domestic industrial enterprises, but also exported, because the Soviet government needed foreign currency for the purchase of different equipment. And of course, waste was one of the items which it was possible to sell on the international market. But in reality, rug and bone export was unprofitable. And for example, the cost of 1 ton of bones costed 70 rubles, but their price on the international market was 2 times lower. And as for waste collecting plants, I want to say that from the very beginning of establishment of this system, the USSR and in Ukraine, the model of pumping resources from the republics began to form. And Ukraine was the second economically developed republic in the Soviet Union after Russian Federation, and that's why in average it had to fulfill about 25% of waste collecting plants. And on this slide you can see concretely what were plans in for different waste. And demands of Soviet enterprises and export pressed the Ukrainian waste collectors and increased competition for waste. And of course, waste collectors faced many challenges and troubles. And the main challenge was quantity of waste. On the one hand, the model of shortage economy began to form in the Soviet Union and in Ukraine in the early 20s, and lack of raw materials resulted in lack of commodities and lack of waste. And in 1928-35, a rational card system was introduced in the USSR, which also limited access to food and material goods. But on the other hand, industrial enterprises became a huge source for collecting industrial waste. Due to the imperfect technologies and low worker skills, they produce enormous quantity of waste. And in some fields, particularly in the production of some metal equipment, the percentage of waste could reach 86%. And another challenge was a sharp competition for waste. And for example, in one archival document, there is an information that in when the head of Chernigiv department of Ukrotilsbir arrived in some village, he found that 200 collectors from across the USSR visited this village. It was also a sharp competition between state and private actors. And private entrepreneurs, they were more competitive because they had better resources, they had experience, money, and they were more flexible and had a good networks. And for example, in Kyiv, near Lukyanivska city dump, a private businessman named Levinson set up an illegal waste buying warehouse and purchased waste collected from the landfills by local residents, and at a price higher than official companies could propose. And this caused a serious damage to Ukrutilsbyr, and Ukrutilsbyr particularly called to police and demanded to arrest these entrepreneurs. And of course, there were many another manifestations of unfair business methods used by many waste collectors. And as for waste collecting spaces, I want to say that rural areas was the primary sites for collecting bones and drugs. And this demonstrates consequences with practices of the Russian Empire. And the typical Soviet waste collector resembled a junk dealer from the late 19th century who exchanged collected waste for a hard-to-find haberdashery in rural areas. And in this context, I would like to stress the agency of haberdashery and oath. In the 1920s, 30s, the rural population often refused to sell waste for money. Instead, it wanted to barter it for haberdashery items which were in severe shortage. And furthermore, waste collection in villages relates on the oath. And this deals with the problem of logistics. Waste from rural areas was transported primarily by horse-drawn carts, and however, horses required feed, and that's why the feed at that period was in the short supply. And it was impossible to acquire haberdashery and oat, particularly feed for horses, without a special permission of Narkomtorg. And another thing I also want to stress on the agency of mud. Waste collection in the villages was a seasonal work. It depended on the drying of the mud on the roads and possibility to drive carts into the villages. And in average, the season of waste collecting in the rural areas lasted 3-4 months from spring to autumn. In cities, waste collection sites included various enterprises, institutions, landfills, and I found also that, for example, pioneers under the head of some representative Ukrutilsbyr collected waste on the cemeteries. And it's hard to imagine what did pioneers could find and take from these cemeteries. And with the onset of industrialization, residential cooperatives, which were viewed as waste factories, began to involve in these activities. Ferrous scrap metal was collected primarily from the dismantling of various obsolete enterprises, sugar refineries, and infrastructure. Non-ferrous metals were collected from landfills and from the population in the form of various kitchenware, pots, pans, samovars, spoons, forks, knives. The main source of bronze was church bells, which were removed as a part of anti-religious campaign. As a result of collectivization and Holodomor, the amount of bones available in villages decreased dramatically, yet they continued to be collected during Holodomor, and starving people had to compete with the collection organizations for bone and animal waste. And the main source of maculatura were archives. And in 1928, in the USSR started a sharp paper crisis. And in some cities, a special profession even emerged for people who cut clean, usable pieces from the used paper. And the cleaning of archives of useless materials was justified not only by economic, but also by the political need to rewrite history. In just 3 years, years, the number of archival documents in Ukraine decreased by 40%, and a large part of valuable documentary heritage was destroyed. And with the onset of industrialization, waste collection plants increased significantly. And since 1928, the practice of involvement population in mass campaigns of waste collecting was introduced. However, they had a longer duration than subotniks, and they were given name weekly, to weekly, monthly, to monthly, and they often followed one another, forming a continuous cycle of mobilization of population. And participation in these companies contributed to the forming the identity of a new Soviet man. And a special vocabulary borrowed from the military was invented. Breakthroughs, assault, storming, socialist competition, and Stakhanovite movement were introduced in this field. With the beginning of industrialization, it became clear that the existing system, with its multitude actors, could not ensure the fulfillment of the constantly growing production plans. And therefore, in the early 1930s, a new highly centralized administrative mechanism was created, and only two companies were left on the market. The all-union company CIUS, established in 1932, and the consumer cooperative represented by Vukov Spilka. And they divided zones of waste collection. And so, therefore, my conclusions. In 1920s, were a kind of management experiment during which the USSR, including Ukraine, tested the most effective model of waste collecting for recycling. However, the cost of fulfilling the plans in 1920s was very high. Destroying churches, obliterated archives, and the seizure of animal waste from starving population. It was precisely in 1920s that a mechanism was formed for extracting waste from the periphery to the center. Despite the fact that these materials were delivered to both all Union and Republican enterprises, they all ultimately served the sustain of the Soviet authoritarian regime. However, at the same time, the basic waste collection methods were established, sources were identified, and corresponding infrastructure was created, which lasted within the minor changes until the collapse of the USSR. And the first generation of Soviet personnel in this field was trained.
Thank you, Tetiana, for your presentation. And Natalia, you can start your presentation.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for organizing and thank you for inviting me. That's a great opportunity to present my research. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it's going to work, so let me know. So in this presentation, I'm exploring how by the late 1980s, Ukrainian society became engrossed in radiation and nitrate poisoning panics over toxic waste found in food and water. And it's a shame that Tetiana didn't finish her presentation because that would be like a perfect transition to my topic when the concept of waste in the Soviet Union changed and like people and, ordinary citizens who care about, household waste or industrial to waste, kind of this like visible materiality. So their concern shifted to this toxic, invisible modern toxins. So this piece is a part of my current book project on the economy of waste and environmental citizenship in the Soviet Union. And as I argue here and overall in my book, concerns over waste represented a form of mass environmental thinking under socialism that defined the proper relations between the economy and the environment. Politicized waste and anxieties, as I call them, prompted people to defend their consumer and ecological rights and to reimagine their relationship with a socialist state through the concept of environmental citizenship. All right, so my research contributes to the history of late Soviet Ukrainian environmentalism in two ways. First, the current historiography focuses mostly on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And in this story, the environmental movement in late Soviet Ukraine basically equals the anti-nuclear movement. So this focus on Chernobyl and radiation is very well justified. I found that people were concerned about a variety of toxins, not just radiation. So I call this phenomenon toxic layering, the term that I borrowed from Magdalena Stavkovsky research, and I put one of her wonderful articles here as an example. And so she used this term to describe the perception of toxicity among the people living near the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in Kazakhstan. As Stavkovsky explained, radiation coming from nuclear testing represented just one layer of pollution in the area. Since Nikita Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign in the mid-1950s, the region was also subjected to an intensive pesticides and herbicides exposure. The resultant toxic layering shaped people's understanding of toxicity and made it difficult for scientists to determine whether radiation, pesticides, or people's lifestyles were to blame for their various health problems. And I observe the same phenomenon in case of late Soviet Ukraine. So my second contribution concerns the politicization of invisible modern toxins. Following the publication of the book Eco-Nationalism by Jane Dawson, scholars have focused their attention primarily on the relationship between environmentalism and nationalism in Ukraine, describing this new political project as ecological nationalism or environmental nationalism. That's kind of used like synonymously. In my research, I explore an alternative path showing how the rise of environmentalism was connected to the development of consumerism, and how the consumer movement successfully promoted the environmentalist agenda at the grassroots level in Ukraine. So two fears shaped Ukrainians' people imagination as environmental citizens. One was of nitrates, another of radiation. Reports about these two invisible toxins penetrating food and drinking water and rendering them unfit for human consumption worried the public to the extent that by the late 1980s, Ukrainian society had become fully engrossed in radiation and nitrate poisoning panics. Newspapers announced a nitrate boom emergency caused by the overuse of nitrogen fertilizers, which they call the nitrogen plague of the 20th century. So in 1988, in this newspaper, Pravda Ukraine is the Truth of Ukraine, a chief sanitary doctor of Ukraine, Anatoly Khanenko, acknowledged the rise of nitrate levels in vegetables. At the request of the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, regional sanitary and epidemiological stations in Crimea, for example, carried out 234 inspections, and nitrate levels at almost a quarter of the produce exceeded the standard. A similar situation was in Kherson and other regions of Ukraine where there is well-developed agriculture. Kasyanenko admitted that nitrate chronic contamination could cause serious health problems because when accumulated in the human body, nitrates became nitrites and then carcinogens. Early spring cabbages, radishes, and scallions were of particular concern, since people did not cook them and consume them raw, so all of the nitrates were coming directly into their bodies. The popular panic over nitrates and other toxins, undetectable to a human eye, smell, touch, and taste, was so widespread that some Ukrainian agriculturalists accused society of ignorant nitrate neurasthenia. This only convinced further people that farmers and the state had something to hide from them. So to illustrate my point in more detail, how people imagine toxic layering, I will explore a set of letters sent by readers from Ukraine to a leading Soviet newspaper, the Literature Gazette, in 1990, in response to one article published by their journalist Anatoly Rubinov on nitrate and radiation pollution. So at that time, Rubinov was a vice president of the Federation of Consumer Societies of the Soviet Union, and he sought to survey drinking water pollution in the Soviet Union. He had recently returned from France, where consumer and environmental activists mapped the tap water quality in all French regions by inviting readers to administer nitrate-sensitive tests inserted in the magazine's special issue. So Rubinov wanted to conduct a similar citizen science project in the Soviet Union and received at least 170 letters, including 47 from Ukraine, from aspiring citizen scientists who requested nitrate tests to measure drinking water impurity in their localities. So this project never fully realized. By considered collectively, these letters revealed new sensibilities among urban dwellers toward invisible toxicity, as well as the growing demands for specific rights and environmental justice. So the letter writers often identified zones of multi-layered toxicity as clusters around big industrial cities with multiple layers of pollution created by nuclear power plant byproducts, migrating agricultural chemicals, and industrial waste in rivers. So here is a couple of examples. Alexei Bondar described how his native town, Marganets, in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, suffered from acid rains that deprived them of clean water and fresh vegetables. The nearby Zaporizhzhia thermal power station often burned low-quality coal to produce electricity, and that saturated the air with a pollutant gas called sulfur dioxide. Water vapor emitted extensively by another local industrial giant, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, reacted with this gas to produce highly toxic rainfall, and as Bondar explained, after which even the grass withered, to say nothing of cucumbers, which we practically never saw. Another person, Irina Lukyanova from Vinnytsia, asked for a nitrate test card because she used a well located near the main roadway. In addition to pollution coming from transport, the district sanitary and epidemiological station did not chlorinate the water for several years in this well because now that service was paid. So Lukyanova worried about radiation, and she explicitly says about this in her letter, but that was only one of multiple invisible toxins that she found herself exposed to. Zones of multi-layered toxicity encapsulated new wastefulness, the loss of products, natural resources, labor, and energy due to toxins. Drinking water, cucumbers, and other fresh vegetables turned unconsumable and useless because of accumulated toxicity. People who grew cucumbers toiled in vain. The Soviet consumer economy multiplied uselessness by absorbing industrial waste and mixing it with consumer products. So thinking in terms of ecological or toxin-damaged bodies prompted people to develop new interspecies solidarities with other human and non-human beings who happened to suffer from the same toxic exposure. So when a male Crimean resident living near the Perga chemical plants enumerated in his letter those who suffered within a zone of this environmental crisis, he included not only people, but also bees, vegetables, fruits, and berries. Bees were dying, and plants had shown many changes. We have a real ecological calamity here. Herbicides, poisons, fertilizers. Bees are dying, vegetables, fruits, and berries have changed a lot, and he underlines that everyone is unwell. And of course, as this men continue, we are a doomed people simply because we're surrounded by leukemia, while neither we nor our children have ever dreamed of Geiger dosimeters. So facing these precarious conditions, people desperately wanted to reclaim some measure of control over the invisible toxicity of their surroundings through citizens' practiced science. Viktor Zavartany from Kyiv enclosed a photograph of his two adorable children, both of whom have been born after the Chernobyl catastrophe. As the concerned parent explained in his letter, of course, there is no possibility to check how many radionuclides we consume with food and water. But since you kindly offer packages for checking the nitrate presence in water, we ask you to send one to us as well. So we simply need to do something. So this is not our children's fault, as he continues, that we pursue such, like he called, like rational economic activities. So Zavartany was far from alone in his anxieties that invisible radiation and nitrates deprived citizens of their environmental independence. The lack of accessible Geiger counters, nitrate-sensitive test kits, and other mass-produced home-friendly testing tools for invisible radiation and nitrates made many citizens suspect that the Soviet state actually forbade their production and therefore purposely contaminated people as in an act of subjugation. So people saw the advance of legal consumer and environmental rights as a way to tackle invisible toxicity. First and foremost was the right to an environment that was safe for people's lives and health. And again, in their letters, people explain that to defend these new rights, they are ready to do it not only through ecological clubs and nature protection groups, but also through consumer associations. So consumerism and environmentalism effectively blended together in this case. So as a female engineer from Kharkiv described in her letter, she realized the need for the protection of consumer rights and for the support of defenseless consumers because her scientific training made her conscious of how horrible the poisoning of the environment by chemicals was. Vladislav Kuznetsov from Zolotonosha summarized the essence of the struggle for consumer rights as a battle against state monopolistic monsters. So the newly revealed toxic layering prompted consumer societies in Ukraine to prioritize ecological safety and environmental protection in their agenda. Overall, new concerns over invisible toxicity after 1989 further politicized waste anxieties and generated demands for environmental justice. So here's a few examples. One is Odessa Regional Consumer Protection Union, founded by 60-year-old Grigory Shevchenko in August 1989. A former army colonel and first mate on the ocean-going dredger, Shevchenko experienced the Chernobyl disaster firsthand as a member of the cleanup crew. In 1991, he also led the Ukrainian Association of Consumer Societies as a vice president and proudly reported how the association monitored food for possible contamination with invisible toxins. So as Shevchenko explained to a journalist, quote, unscrupulous businessmen were selling contaminated mushrooms from the Chernobyl area, but our local organization in Donetsk alerted the national Ukrainian organization last spring, which was in 1990, and this was stopped, the end of the quote. 1 year later, in 1991, Shevchenko's team of local consumer activists in Odessa warned the authorities about substandard rice from Vietnam being unloaded in the city port, and the government took actions as well in this case. So another organization in Kryvyi Rih, chaired by Natalia Sekret, focused on the problems of polluted air, food, and drinking water. As he later said to journalists, like in 1992, quote, we have a higher incidence of serious cancers and a higher premature mortality rate than in other cities. and the authorities simply cannot cope with the problems, the end of the quote. Another key consumer association was the Ukrainian Association of Consumer Societies, officially registered in June 1990. Its first vice president and leading figure was Grigory Falkovich. Now he is a well-known Ukrainian Jewish poet. But back then in the Soviet Union, he worked in the Ukrainian branch of the All-Union Research Institute of Consumer Demand and Market Trends. Similarly to many of his colleagues from the institute, he joined the consumer rights movement during Perestroika and led its Ukrainian association. So in May 1991, Ukraine adopted a new consumer protection law, and the Ukrainian Association of Consumer Societies was instrumental in this process. Concerns over toxic waste profoundly shaped the substance of this legal act. The existing evidence suggests that rights for the ecological consumer featured prominently in early drafts of the law, one of which was actually being prepared by the Ukrainian Association of Consumer Societies. The initial draft seems to include both consumer and environmental protection. But as a representative of the lawmaking commission admitted during the discussion of the draft of this law in Verkhovna Rada in March 1991, quote, all commissions concluded that the law should not extend its effect to the environment, but that because other legislative acts should be in effect in this regard. Although in the future it is not excluded that we will reach such an understanding of this issue, the end of the quote. And he means this relationship between the consumer and the environment. Yet for some deputies, even at that time, this separation between the consumer and the environment already felt artificial. So ideally, the goal of the new consumer law was to defend the ecological consumer. And as a deputy chairman of the Commission of Verkhovna Rada on Human Rights proclaimed during the same discussion of the draft law, quote, the point is that consumer rights are a broader concept. So we consume air, we consumers because we consume air. We consume water, that also makes us consumers. We use transportation, we interact with the Ministry of Health. All of these are consumer rights. Therefore, lawmaking shouldn't end there. So even in its final abridged version adopted in May 1991, the Ukrainian consumer protection law contained clear signs of new ecological thinking. Its Article 9, which is called Consumers' Right to Product Safety, protected not only the consumer's life, health, and property, but also the environment, and it was separately. So it was regardless whether the consumer rights, the consumer life, health, or property was in danger. So the protection for the environment was separated from that. The law demanded, for example, that when creating a new product, the developer has to pass state expertise to make sure the new consumer product was safe to people's life, health, and property, as well as to the environment. The law also required to establish clear service life or expiration dates for products which, once expired, became dangerous to the life and health of citizens, as well as to the environment. Article 18, which is called Rights of Consumer Associations, granted consumer societies the right to demand from the government bodies and enterprises to stop the manufacturing, sale, and marketing of products that were not only dangerous, again, to the life, health, and property of citizens, but also harmful to the environment. So I will stop my presentation here, but I'm happy to address any questions that the audience have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalia. Okay, then the next presenter is Dmytro Yesypenko. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Dear friends, dear colleagues, добрий вечір, добрий ранок. I'm privileged to join the conversation of this seminar series, which involves so many different perspectives and even disciplines. And my presentation will be probably a little bit different, more from literary studies and cultural history perspective. When we think about Ukraine's environment today, the first images that come to mind are scorched and mined fields, flooded territories, and bombed neighborhoods and industrial sites. Yet environmental history is also shaped by less visible forces: air, water, soil, and the ways these elements become entangled with human beings, with their bodies, with their fears, with imaginations. And epidemics sit precisely at this intersection. A paradox stands at the center of my talk. Epidemics are among the most deeply rooted experiences in human history. They change how people live, work, move, and mourn. Yet societies are remarkably quick to suppress or forget epidemic memory. If we pause and ask what culturally has remained from the COVID-19 pandemic, the picture is surprisingly thin compared with the scale of disruption these epidemics brought to our lives. In such moments, literature often becomes the most enduring archive of epidemic experience. It preserves not statistics, but images, metaphors, and emotional structures through which communities have attempted to comprehend disease, fears, losses. Today, I focus on epidemics that are no longer with us in the way COVID was or is, and I will focus mostly on cholera and plague in the first part of the presentation. In the 19th century, they, especially cholera, was far more devastating and chronic than outbreaks of recent decades. Yet our contemporary imagination still relies heavily on representational patterns developed in the past. When we picture a plague city or imagine contaminated space, we draw, consciously or not, on a long tradition of literary and vernacular imagery. In my talk will consider several key texts, literary texts, that have shaped the cultural understanding of epidemics in Ukrainian and Polish literature, just for contrast and also to underline the difference, the distinctive nature of Ukrainian narratives. So you can see on the screen that there will be Ivan Franko's novel Boa Constrictor with its miasmatic vision of cholera in Drohobych, Adam Mickiewicz and Juliusz Słowatsky, their poems of 1820s, 1830s. Their epidemic narratives will illuminate what is distinctive in Ukrainian depictions of Ukrainian literature. And Shevchenko, Taras Shevchenko, his poem Chuma, 1848. After that, I will come to the selected works of contemporary Ukrainian literature and music, song lyrics, where epidemic metaphors increasingly intersect with images of war, displacement, and environmental devastation. Throughout the presentation, I will return once and once again to three questions. How do these texts imagine the environments of disease? What happens to memory in epidemic narratives? And how are older or even ancient epidemic imaginaries reused today, especially in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine? To understand how 19th century culture linked epidemics and environment, it is helpful to begin not with plague, but with cholera. For decades, especially in 19th century, it overshadowed most infectious diseases in mortality. Yet its causes and transmission were poorly understood. Before germ theory gained ground, a different model dominated medical and public thinking: miasma theory. According to the miasmatic worldview, cholera travels not primarily through water or contact, but through poisoned air, winds, humidity, and topography mattered. Disease arose where air stagnated over rotting matter, swamps, or overcrowded dwellings. In epidemic imperial imagination, I mean here both British and Russian imperial imagination, the ultimate source of the contaminated atmosphere lay somewhere in the east. For example, for British imagination, it would be, first of all, basin of the Khank, of the river Khank, cast as cholera's eternal homeland. This is the conceptual background of Ivan Franko's Boa Constrictor novel of 1878. The plot is set in Drohobych, Galician town, yet its environmental logic follows miasmatic thinking closely. Franko's protagonist Herman grows up in Lan, which is Jewish district on the town's outskirts, and this is a suffocating place. Low huts grow together so tightly that almost no light enters. Waste and puddles fill the alleys. The air, the sopuch in Ukrainian, which is not usual word for povitria, so this air is foul and heavy. Such descriptions were common in 19th century literature. One might recall, for instance, how Gogol described the poor Jewish district of Warsaw in his novel Razbulba, 1845. A detailing from her story is especially telling. On the wall of the protagonist of Herman's house hangs a painting of Indian Bengal showing a boa constrictor, a snake crushing a gazelle. The image works on several layers. It depicts the East as a predatory dangerous space. At the same time, it represents Bengal as the cradle of hot vapors, marshy air, and epidemic origins. The boa becomes a symbol of exotic menace, while the painting itself visualizes imagined epidemic routes from Asia to Europe. Land appears as a swamp-like hollow where contaminated air, water, and soil overlap. Khanenko contrasts this Drohobych district with Hubychi, the Galician village to which Herman eventually escapes from the town. Hubychi lies higher, with cleaner air and open horizons. In the story's logic and in miasmatic theory, this matters. Elevation signifies both physical recovery for the character, but also the moral possibility. Herman's improvement seems to depend on leaving the pit for a place that is higher, but also dry, bright, and well ventilated. Obviously, boa constrictor is not a medical tract. Its power lies in how vividly it captures a way of thinking widespread in 19th century Europe. The disease arises from corrupted air, that certain neighborhoods and landscapes are intrinsically dangerous, while others promise cleansing winds and safety. A similar environmental logic appears in Polish Romanticism, in the poetry, though with significant differences in tone and, importantly, in setting. Juliusz Słowacki's poem Ojciec Zadumiony, The Father of the Plague Striking, 1848, offers an intense portrayal of plague carried by poisoned air. The poem unfolds in an oriental landscape. A family shelters under a tent in the sandy valley of El Arish on the border of Egypt and Palestine. The father speaks as one by one, all his children, and even finally his wife, all of them die from the plague. The contaminated air inside the tent, the family tent, becomes a silent executioner. Adam Mickiewicz reinforces this eastward framing of epidemic danger. In the ballad Alpukhara, which is part of his poem Konrad Wallenrod, 1828, the defeated leader Almanzor brings a plague-like pestilence to his Christian enemies, a threat imagined as coming from the east. In another part of the same poem, Konrad Wallenrod, Mickiewicz also introduces a wandering female personification of pestilence drawn from Slavic folklore. Then this figure moves across legendary medieval landscapes. It's not Polish rural territory. This figure anticipates imagery that you will later see in Shevchenko's text. Okay. So if Słowacki and Mickiewicz locate epidemic catastrophe in distant or mythic spaces, Taras Shevchenko brings it home to Ukraine, even though he has not been at Ukraine at that time. He was in what is now Kazakhstan steppes. And in this poem that you see on the screen, Chuma, 1848, the epidemic strikes an unnamed Ukrainian village. There is no desert, no exotic scenery, no oriental setting, only familiar huts, fields, a church, and a community that gradually vanishes. The opening of the poem is with a stark folkloric line. The plague walked with a shovel. This female embodiment of pestilence belongs to a broad Slavic repertoire of personified diseases, mostly with female face. Shevchenko knew this tradition, yet he resists turning it into allegory or spectacle. She is simply the force moving like a broom, or with a broom rather, across the land. The landscape quickly empties of sound and movement. Animals stir, bells fall silent, sextons fur-coated and sewn into hides for protection, whole bodies until they too die. Houses become tombs, shared spaces lose meaning. The scene ill anticipates what Foucault would later describe as a quarantine, the complex model of the disciplinary mechanism, but what we see is rather from below through present experience rather than from above, from administrative protocols. The poem's final gesture is chilling. After the epidemic extinguishes all life, strangers from the steppe, and this is important to mention, this element of the poem, some mysterious strangers arrive and burn the village. The wind scattered the ashes and no trace remained. The fire may hint at crude sanitation, but it's also an act of erasure. A community disappears so completely that only this poem, this Shevchenko's text, remains as testimony. Notably, Shevchenko originally drafted the poem with cholera instead of plague, then crossed it out. You can see on the screen the paragraph from the manuscript. Cholera was too contemporary and too realistic, and also associated with undignified imagery, disgusting in other words, whereas plague carried mythic gravity. It allowed him to depict total catastrophe, combining folklore, miasmatic atmosphere, and romantic apocalypse, still rooted in a recognizable Ukrainian words. So across all the works mentioned, several patterns recur. First, miasmatic worldview. Disease emerges from corrupted air and soil, climate and topography matter, landscapes carry, among other, moral weight. Second, folkloric and biblical imagery, wandering figures of pestilence, job-like sufferers, like in Slovatsky's text, also echoes of Exodus and Revelation, these biblical books. The third point is different uses of space. Slovatsky and Mickiewicz displace epidemics into distant or legendary settings. Khanenko and Shevchenko insist on proximity. Epidemics strike our land, Nasha Zemlya, among our people. And fourth, memory and its failures. In Slovatsky, only father survives as custodian of memory. In Shevchenko, no one survives, only the poem resists erasure. In Khanenko, memory is selective, traumatic, and often fragmented. Epidemic experiences appear too painful to retain fully. And what we can see in contemporary Ukrainian culture and literature in particular is that epidemics, again, rarely function as purely medical events. They metaphorize ruptures in history, the tearing of social fabric, and the invisible injuries that accompany war and ecological destruction. Epidemic imagery becomes a lens for thinking about invasion, occupation, and cultural extinction. Serhii Zhadan is one of quite a few, or even many examples. In a widely cited popular poem of him from the early war in the East after 2014, he writes of cholera pits filled with lime. The lime does not describe an actual outbreak at the time. It fuses medieval plague pits, 19th-century cholera graves, and present-day wartime burials. In his poem that became a song performed by the band Bruto, you can see on the right side of the screen, I quote, "For the second year now, the plague is moving down the city," end of quote. So plague becomes a portrait of urban siege, and the reader can read it as a contemporary siege of Ukrainian cities and towns. Serhii Martinyuk of Kolos, he is both writer and musician. In his COVID-era novel Rol Deshchu, King of Rain, he approaches epidemics as psychological aftershocks of past violence. His narrative blends pandemic imagery with unresolved Soviet and post-Soviet traumas. The war in Donbass and east of Ukraine intrudes into lockdown life of Kyiv. The protagonist's father, a shattered veteran of the Afghan war, interprets the pandemic as a form of cosmic retaliation. I quote, "It seems the planet has started a war against people. It's like we are the wives," end of quote. Here Martinyuk subtly reframes contagion as an environmental revolt, as if damaged landscapes and exhausted ecosystems were pushing back. Epidemic language becomes a way of imagining not only human conflict, but the earth itself turning hostile, a response to long histories of violence, extraction, and neglect. Disease, inherited guilt, and the legacy of militarism intertwining until COVID becomes indistinguishable from the war's internal wounds. And the last literary example is from Artem Chapai. The translation of the Vyvitruvanya novel can be both dissolution in the air or the weathering, and it will appear in English translation pretty soon. So, but before that, I needed to translate by myself. So what you can see is my translation. And this novel pushes the notion even further. In the depicted near future world, where the air does not infect people, it simply dissolves them. I quote, the vanishing of human beings happens after the vanishing of humanness in people, end of quote. There is no microbe, only moral corrosion. The epidemic becomes a metaphor for the collapse of empathy and solidarity. The antidote is the vision of a community where people strive not to destroy the world of themselves. These are only 3 examples. Once again, it's a pretty significant body of recent literature, Ukrainian literature, that turns to epidemic forms to think through war, vulnerability, and collapse. Within this contemporary landscape, Shevchenko's Chuma has acquired renewed resonance. In a recent performance, musician Yaroslav Kaminsky introduces his poem, or Shevchenko's poem, by saying, I quote, for me and for all of us, Russia is the plague of the 21st century, end of quote. The image of the plague, Shevchenko's image of the plague walking across Ukrainian land and the burning of the village until no trace remained, mirrors today's footage of destroyed towns, scorched fields, and erased communities in Ukraine's east and south. It is no coincidence that plague, rather than cholera, has come to dominate wartime imagery in contemporary culture, especially in music and performances. In the 1990s and 2000s, Ukrainian pop culture often used cholera playfully and ironically. Plague, by contrast, like the one depicted by Shevchenko in Chuma, in this tone, with this mood, it carries mythic, apocalyptic force. In wartime, only plague seems adequate to the scale of loss. This is why plague imagery and the idea of surviving and resisting the dreadful black pestilence from the east, direction is known, this idea circulates across contemporary songs and is present in this song lyrics, but in many others actually. The examples on the screen are only a few, many more could be mentioned. These parallels arise not through coordination, but through a shared cultural repertoire that links epidemic catastrophe to threats emerging from beyond the border. And to conclude, I want to draw these threads together. First, in all the texts, epidemics are not merely medical phenomena. They are structures of feeling, ways of articulating vulnerability, invisible danger, and the collapse of order. From Franco's miasmatic Drohobych to Shevchenko's annihilated, unnamed village, from Martinyuk's COVID-era visions to Chapai's speculative dissolutions, epidemic narratives give shape to collective fear and uncertainty. Second, epidemic narratives act as repositories of historic memory. When Jordan writes of cholera pits, or when performers invoke Chuma as a poem about contemporary war, they activate deep cultural reservoirs. Literature becomes an archive of experiences often absent from official narratives, especially rural or marginalized ones. For example, Franco was writing about Galician Jews. Third, epidemic imagination links bodies and landscapes. It binds microbes to myths, winds to violence, and disease to moral and political even meaning. In today's Ukraine, where war, ecocide, and displacement are reshaping both physical and symbolic environments, epidemic metaphor help articulate what is at stake, not only survival, but resistance against erasure. In this sense, epidemic imagery is more than a metaphor. It's a cultural memory technology, one that enables societies to understand suffering, resist oblivion, and imagine survival in the face of forces that threaten to wipe them from the map. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro, and thank you everyone for coming to our seminar. Thank you, dear presenters, for your efforts in presenting the results of your research. Thank you, the team of Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, for hosting this event. Yeah, have a nice day or evening. Please join our next seminars in the next year. Yeah, thank you so much and goodbye.